Hey Furies, question time. What do Norse mythology, Sherlock, and Hot Fuzz all have in common? Well, one thing is a final battle, where you have the final confrontation of your hero and your villain. You get to kill a few characters, and you get to make your readers cry. Final battles appear in almost every story in some shape or form, but the question we'll be talking about today is what makes for a good final battle. Though before we can get to that, we should probably define just what a final battle is. It may call to mind images of the forces of good, all dressed in shiny armor, clashing with obligatorily clad and black bad guys. But final battles appear across multiple genres, most prominently in fantasy and science fiction, but also in action, thriller, mystery, and plenty of others. Simply put, the final battle takes place at the climax of the story, pitting your protagonists against the antagonists in some combative form, with the consequences of said battle determining the outcome of your story. Though we'll be talking more about the science fiction fantasy side of this. A final battle also may or may not include the following. When considering ways to write a final battle, it somewhat comes down to what we'll call primary and secondary conflicts. We'll discuss what they mean, how to use them, and how to subvert them, and we'll also be talking a lot about Lord of the Rings, which is always a fantastic thing to do. So, primary and secondary conflicts. Here's a challenge for you next time you're reading or watching a final battle. If you were to phrase that confrontation between the protagonists and antagonists in a single question, what would that be? Now, I love swords hitting shields, space lasers, and wizards doing things as much as the next guy, but the question is almost never simply asking who is better with a sword or who can fly a spaceship better. The final battle in Pirates of the Caribbean isn't asking whether Jack Sparrow can outsword Davy Jones. It's asking whether Jack has changed and become self-sacrificial enough to defeat Davy Jones by taking his place on the Flying Dutchman. In the Avengers, it's not so much asking whether Iron Man or Loki are stronger, but whether the Avengers can use the power of teamwork needed to defeat Loki, because everyone knows that nothing beats the power of friendship. And these questions are at the heart of the difference between primary and secondary conflicts. The secondary conflict is usually the visual confrontation between your protagonists and antagonists, the who is better with a sword question, while the primary conflict is the internal battle closely related to character or theme, involving a struggle or change within characters that helps determine the outcome of the final battle. The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King is perhaps my favourite example of this. At the climax of the story, Aragorn leads an army against Sauron at the Black Gate. This is a secondary conflict. At the same time, Frodo, Sam, and Gollum come to their final confrontation at Mount Doom. The secondary conflict is being fought at the Black Gate, but the tension of the final battle comes almost entirely from the primary conflict at Mount Doom, where the reader is questioning whether Frodo is strong enough to resist the One Ring after all this time. The answer to this question is integral to the themes of the story and Frodo's character arc, and it's the primary conflict at Mount Doom that ultimately determines the outcome of the secondary conflict with Aragorn at the Black Gate. And there's a good reason that this works. The final battle is the culmination of all of the elements of your story. Having both a primary and a secondary conflict ties your climax to character development, giving the final battle emotional weight by changing the state your characters are in, as well as giving it narrative weight by changing the state your world is in. It also allows the reader to empathize with the characters more by using relatable character struggles in the climax as well as spectacle. Because how many of us have ever had to defend ourselves in a sword fight before? But the question remains, how do you write these conflicts to fit together in a cohesive and persuasive piece of writing? Firstly, the primary conflict a character faces during the final battle cannot come out of nowhere. There's a reason it's less compelling when the hero refuses to kill the villain because honor! But they never had any trouble slaughtering hundreds of his henchmen. Why should they care about a character struggle that was never there beforehand? It feels disconnected from the rest of the story and makes for a relatively hollow character choice. Readers care about choices that are difficult or important to the character, but that importance comes from spending time exploring the nuances of that decision beforehand. Just as the events of the plot lead up to the final battle, the arc of the character should lead up to their primary conflict. In Terry Pratchett's novel The Fifth Elephant, the reader cares when Sam Vimes has to kill someone in the line of duty because it has been explored why he doesn't like to beforehand. So where does this primary conflict come from? In John Truby's book The Anatomy of a Story, he details 3 important elements to designing characters: a weakness, a psychological need, and a moral need. A weakness is simply a character flaw. A psychological need is something that only affects the hero and must be fulfilled within themselves for them to live a better life. While a moral need is something that affects those around them and must be changed within themselves for them to live a better life. For example, in The Last Airbender, Aang's weakness is that he attempts to avoid problems rather than face them. Because of this, his psychological need is to overcome his past and let go of his guilt, while his moral need is to stop being so passive when faced with challenges, because he's letting those around him get hurt and die. It's these three elements of a character that connect the beginning of the story with the final battle. Weaknesses, psychological needs, and moral needs create multi-dimensional characters, and using them in your primary conflicts creates a multi-dimensional final battle, which is always far more interesting. A character overcoming their internal struggles results in what Truby terms the moment of self-revelation. This revelation should be psychological or moral, or both, depending on what kind of needs you established your character to have previously. One way to write this moment of self-revelation into your final battle is, rather than have your character turn around and preach to the reader, "Well, now I understand the true power of friendship," have them take a new course of action that they could not have taken before. You can see this trope in stories all over the place. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, it's only in his moment of self-revelation that Hamlet overcomes his depression and indecisiveness, his psychological need. And in doing so, he can finally confront the man that killed his father, which he could not bring himself to do before. A self-revelation that leads a character to take a new course of action when the tension is low means less, because there is less at stake for them, while a self-revelation that leads to a new course of action when the tension is high feels like a more convincing character change, because there is more for them to gain or lose, and it's at the final battle that the story reaches its highest point of tension. Now, while it's common for protagonists to succeed in both their primary and secondary conflicts, this isn't always necessary, and subverting this model can lead to some really interesting moments in a story. In The Return of the Jedi, the audience is led to believe that the lightsaber duel between Luke and Darth Vader is where it has all been leading to. This duel is a secondary or visual conflict, but the whole spectacle is subverted when Luke bests Vader but is defeated by the Emperor anyway. Suddenly, the fact that Luke is a better duelist doesn't matter, and it's here that the true primary conflict comes into play, whether Vader will choose the Emperor or his family. And it's this struggle that decides the outcome of the final battle, not the lightsaber duel that we were all led to believe. The fact that Vader doesn't even use a lightsaber when turning on the Emperor emphasizes the important themes of there being good in everyone, and that family and loyalty can change the world more than violence ever could. Now, fantasy and sci-fi have a tendency to rely on a trope where one hero is largely responsible for the defeat of the antagonist, and there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. Having a story focused on one individual can be done well, but if you want to write a final battle that stays away from this trope, having a protagonist lose their secondary conflict in the final battle is one way to do it. It creates an unexpected moment of tension and danger for the reader, as well as easily allowing for the involvement of other heroes in the defeat of your antagonist, because your protagonist needs them and can't do it themselves. Who doesn't need the power of friendship? Though an important side note is that there's usually more than one primary conflict at play during the final battle. Luke having to resist the dark side, Vader having to choose between family and Emperor, and the TIE fighter pilots questioning whether the good guys are really the ones with the space laser called the Death Star.
Are we the baddies?
But there are other interesting ways to use primary and secondary conflicts. Let's be honest, the evil guys always have cooler outfits, and what better reason could there be for an author to want a character to turn having the character succeed in their secondary conflict but only at the cost of them losing the primary conflict can be an effective way to do this. It gives real consequences to a character flaw and allows the reader to see the character in a radically different environment to where they were before, which can be far more interesting than simply referencing a weakness without deeply exploring its consequences. Avatar: The Last Airbender Zuko is a great example. While definitely more of a grey character than strictly evil in Season 2, Zuko helps beat Team Avatar, conquers Ba Sing Se, and returns home victorious, but he did so at the cost of giving into his anger and betraying the one person who truly loves him, his uncle. For the obvious reason, this usually doesn't happen at the climactic final battle. It would be a bit disappointing to have your hero get to the end and say, you know what, the evil guys do have better outfits. The end. Instead, this tends to happen partway through the story. The obvious exception to this are stories about fallen heroes. The Godfather is the story of a man who at the final battle beats his enemies, but does so at the cost of him becoming the very thing he used to hate, winning his secondary conflict but losing his primary. He became a fallen hero. On a different level, final battles are, by nature, meant to be final, right? Well, not to some authors. In fact, a lot of authors. There's an incredibly common subversion of the final battle that plenty of authors use. How many times have you read a book where the heroes take down the villain and save the day, only to return home and find that the villain is making one last-ditch effort to hurt them or someone they love? Seriously, for how common this trope is, it took me ages to think of examples. In The Lord of the Rings, destroying the ring in Mount Doom isn't actually the end of the story in the book. That may have been the final battle, but the hobbits return home and find Saruman has taken over and destroyed the Shire, their home in the very thing they were fighting to protect all along. Likewise, in The Incredibles, you'll remember that Syndrome is defeated in a big final battle in the city, but he then turns up at their home threatening to kill Jack-Jack. While the final battle is typically over the grander goals or plans of the antagonist, this one last stand tends to be an attempt to hurt the heroes more personally. The last stand can be a powerful moment for the author to put the protagonists in their most vulnerable position and reveal what the stakes truly are. Usually the villain fails in their last-ditch effort to hurt the hero, but on the rare occasion that they succeed, it can make for a truly poignant ending to a story, that despite winning the final battle, they couldn't protect what they cared about most. If that's what you want to say thematically, then that's up to you. You pessimists. In a sense, Doctor Who's episode Jenny is sort of an example of this. The Doctor saves the day, but the villain makes one last stand and a person dear to the Doctor, his daughter, sort of, died anyway. Hashtag bring back Jenny. So how might you write your final battle? Firstly, giving it primary and secondary conflicts makes for a multi-dimensional climax to your story. Secondly, this primary conflict should arise out of the moral or psychological needs that have been explored throughout the story beforehand. Thirdly, this should manifest in them taking a new course of action that they could not do beforehand. And fourthly, there are plenty of ways to subvert the typical final battle that make for an interesting or unique story. Whether you use these is simply up to you and depends on the kind of story you want to write. But that's all from me. A big thank you to all of my patrons over on Patreon who helped choose the topic for this video. If you like what I make and want to support me or our Supreme Leader Mishka, then that is one way to do so, and thank you if you do. In the meantime, I'd love for you to come follow me on Twitter or Facebook, send me stuff you made, the address or links in the description below, and stay nerdy, sub-viewers. I will see you in the future. Also, if you want pictures of my cat, you should come follow me on Twitter.